Hi, Joe. How are you going?
Good. How are you going?
Yeah, very good, thank you. We welcome everybody back here for another Venezuela conversation, and of course, today it falls on the 4th of July. So we thought that we would discuss some of the issues involved in what the 4th of July means to us, and what it's going to mean for the future as well. So I thought that, of course, I thought that we would start looking at what does the 4th of July mean for the American people themselves, and what does it mean for people around the world generally? What is the history of the 4th of July? Is it something that should be celebrated, or is it something that should be um, denounced and decried as American nationalism, or should we see things differently? So, what do you think, Joe?
Well, I think first of all we need to start off from the point of history. I mean, the 4th of July celebrates the winning of independence of the former American colonies from Great Britain. In that sense, for Americans, it is something to be proud of. I mean, that revolutionary battle uh, changed the world as well as their prospects for a nation of their own. Had tremendous influence, and we need to be aware of that. And I think there is a good reason why Americans celebrate the day as something important to them. But we must also understand that since then, the very principles, I'm talking about the principles of democracy, sovereignty, the will of the people that were at the core of the American Revolution have been turned on their head. And the United States became a colonial power in its own right. Started off by annexing by force parts of Mexico. Uh, Now, today, 55% of US mainland territory used to be part of Mexico. It's huge. The same thing across the Caribbean. Uh, and then in the mid 1870s, after victory in the American Spanish War, Spain was forced to hand over Cuba and the Philippines, which both became American colonies. There are places like Guam, Puerto Rico, also that that became colonies of the United States. Move fast forward to the 21st century, and while many Americans celebrate the July uh, as the founding date of their nation, for peoples in many other countries, the July 4th is a day that they mark the need for their liberation and freedom from subjugation, essentially, in most cases, from the United States. So there's two sides to July the 4th. Of course, we in Australia uh, do not celebrate the independence because it's not our country, but there are issues that we have with the United States as well.
Of course, and it points to the fact of Australia's dependence on the United States as an ally, and yet uh, very little does Australia receive from the United States, apart from promises of um, support and apart from support and economic reliance. The United States actually gives very little to Australia, and yet we throw our weight behind the United States constantly. And so I guess that comes down to the type of ideology that Australia holds at the moment in terms of how we view our democracies and so on.
Yeah, I think That's right. But I think there's also another dimension, and really, it's been a history over the last near 200 years, really more since the beginning of the colonial era with the taking of the Americas, of all things, but into Asia as well. That that economic and political power, through diplomacy or gunboat diplomacy was the case then, has a lot of influence. Uh, that after the Second World War, the overwhelming major nation acting in that way was the United States. The Second World War knocked others into the backseat. And one thing that explains what's been happening to a lot of countries, and including Australia, is what happened after the Second World War with the rise of the Bretton Woods Agreement, which set up a new international trade institutions like the World Trade Organization, World Bank, at that stage as the undamaged power in the world. The other powers had been damaged seriously by the war, was in a position to become the financier of the global financial system by meeting out loans. And it also was the overwhelming political influence in the setting up of the United Nations originally. So that played in the diplomatic sense in the same thing. So the United States had the power from then on to do a lot of arm twisting. One of the main ways it was done is that if you do not agree with this and that policy, then you will not be given access to the global financial market, and that hurt economies. It's enough to destroy economies, and it has been practiced. So Australia was subject to that. Australia at that time, the Australian government was planning to have had an economic plan under John Curtin. And there is an understanding, there are indications the United States threatened Australia with lack of access to the international financial system and international trade and undermine the Australian economy. The Australian government subsequently caved in and has caved in so far. We also know that, and there are stacks of evidence that in 1975, the US government, or through its agencies, played a key role in the overthrow of an elected government. That's the Whitlam government at that time. So there is that pressure. And so Australia is also affected like many other countries. And
Exactly.
to say, I'm quite sure that many politicians dread falling on the wrong side of the United States. And one thing that WikiLeaks did reveal a few years ago through leaked documents from the US Embassy in Canberra was just to the extent that would-be prime ministers and leaders of major political parties have to court the favour of the United States. This is in their own documents.
Yeah. So on the one hand, we see that the United States is a great advocate of democracy and freedom and human rights and so on, and yet then we see that various countries around the world are forced into capitulation to the United States. As you said, Joe, through the international monetary system and so on. And so you've got that double standards, and I think that goes right back, as you were saying earlier, right back to the contradictions or the two positional sides of the United States. That is, on the one hand, seen as this great nation that managed to become independent from Britain, and yet now has turned itself around to be the great military power, and in fact the power around the world that actually abuses the human rights and democracies around the world. And so I guess that brings us onto Latin America and how all of that is enmeshed in the struggles of the Latin American people. So can we talk a little bit about about the Venezuelan revolution, and a little bit about how that threatens the United States. And then we want to look at what's kind of going on in Latin America at the moment, because we can see that there's been some major shifts in the amount of governments that have been elected that are to the left of politics, and all supposedly supporting the people and so on, and looking for ways to build their economies in a different way, independent of the United States, independent of the International Monetary Fund, and so on, and have a look at how that's going to impact on maybe the world, but certainly on the United States itself.
Look, if I may, I'd like to mention something that is a great segue into what you just said, and that's the connection with this double standards. I'll say, first of all, say that there's all the talk of democracy, rule of law, freedom. It depends where and who. For instance, the United States or Australia, or the governments of both countries, do say nothing about Saudi Arabia, which is currently executing a stack of people. Right? Say nothing about Israel, that's using systematic, targeted murder of Palestinians and applying what amounts to an apartheid state in its own territory against non-white Jews. So, there are other examples. In Latin America, the United States has been behind, supporting to the hilt, a murderous regime in Colombia, supporting Bolsonaro in Brazil, that's causing a great tragedy there. So, we need to be careful when we accept slogans, to know what is really behind them and to know really whose interests they're in. But I want to mention the case of Alex Saab at this point, because I think it makes a connection, illustrates the double standards. And Alex Saab, an ambassador of Venezuela, found his plane diverted and forced to land in Cabo Verde just over 2 years ago. The United States is one small island nation off the coast of Africa, has tremendous economic clout over, and pressured the government there into using its police to drag Alex Saab out of the plane and put him into what amount of solitary confinement, which amounts to, similar to Assange, torture. He was denied medicine for cancer treatment, which he needs, obviously. He's been some time in the United States. He was extradited there and faces a charge or charges of money laundering. The reason? Alex Saab was negotiating trade deals to get access for Venezuela to food, medicines, and other vital needs. So negotiating that amounts to money laundering, according to Washington. So he's there under all sorts of dubious conditions, still under virtual solitary confinement, and that's a violation of international law on a few counts. One is that the dragging somebody like that without proper judicial process and so on is illegal according to international law. It's also illegal according to United States law. The other major illegality is that, according to the Geneva Convention, signed by the United States, Australia, and most countries in 1961, that diplomats or people in diplomatic service are immune from charges. Right? It's an open violation of that. So regardless of international law, the United States pressured and got involved in Alex Saab's extradition. So that is part of the double standard, because at the same time, the people they don't like for political reasons, because they have a different policy or because they see them as an enemy, that everything they do, they claim is a violation of international law. just like supporting somebody as a president of Venezuela, uh, Juan Guaido. Juan Guaido was never elected as president. He was elected, yes, into the parliament, but not because he had massive support of the population, his electorate. He got in like some people with, 2 or 3% of the vote get into the Senate in Australia. There's a similar sort of electoral system that he got in through. So he was not particularly well known or popular ever in Venezuela. But he was allowed to declare himself not inside the parliament, out in the street as president, and he's been supported. He's still been supported. So that's another double standard about the rule of law, the rule of democracy, and so on. So we move on to what's been happening, why all this is happening in relation to Venezuela. Well, the Bolivarian Revolution, which began at the end of the 1990s, poses a significant threat to the United States' global interests, and particularly interests in Latin America. For one major reason, because the Venezuelan people stood up and said, we don't want any more. We don't want this, on steroids, neoliberalism anymore. We want to be running our own country. We want to make our own choices as to who's going to be our leadership and how we're going to organise and move forward as a society. So that was unpalatable to Washington and Wall Street, I should say. And this is a major threat to the status quo. It is a major threat because it has inspired movements or helped to inspire movements in Latin America and the Caribbean. But it's also something that's been watched in nations on every continent by people there saying, all right, the Venezuelans are doing something. Maybe there's a chance for us to do something as well. Maybe there's a road we can follow according to our own conditions, of course, that we can be determinant of our own future. So this is the example that the United States is very afraid of. And just the last bit you mentioned what they're calling the pink tide, which is, to me, sounds, oh, no, it's a bit of a funny term. But anyway, the reality is, as you said, Helen, is that, we shouldn't just see it in terms of figureheads. The peoples in these nations are saying, right, same thing. We've had enough of the way things are going, the status quo, the economic policies that leave most of us worse off. We want to become masters of our own destiny, and we want to have our own nation that we decide where it goes. So that, again, is the same sort of threat, but it is happening. And we've got to say that, and it's important to say here that that in Colombia, Gustavo Petro has just won the presidential election in very difficult circumstances. Now, that came out of a movement. The people remember just over a year ago, there was a lot of unrest in the country over rising prices and wages and so on. Sort of things that we've got here, but more extreme there. But there was also a reaction against systematic oppression and human rights abuses in the country. So Petro and his people in the process of forming government, and we'll see what will happen there. In Brazil, Luis da Silva, the polls are saying, is going to easily win the presidential election in October this year. And similar thing will happen. Now, I've mentioned those two countries because they are the principal allies of the United States, have been in recent years in Latin America. Colombia has been the staging ground for military attacks on Venezuela. So these two things will have a significant effect. Uh, and uh, and I just want to mention one other thing, because just over a week ago, anyway, last week, the United States hosted the what's it called, the Summit of the Americas. And the background to that, as a lot of people know, the United States uh, refused to invite, of course, Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua. As a result of that, 7 other Latin American countries refused to attend. So there were 10 missing. That's half of the continent.
And I think,
It,
just to
it,
interrupt there,
it,
I think that indicates what you were talking about earlier, how the strength of Venezuela's revolution, the strength of Cuba's revolution, and the fact that it's been able to sustain the onslaught from the United States and from Wall Street, economically and politically. The fact that those countries have been, and Nicaragua has been involved in that process as well, been able to survive and continue to move forward, against all odds and against the onslaught from the United States and Wall Street, has given courage and given strength to the movements that are occurring now in Latin America. And I think that goes back to what you were saying earlier. And I think that's extremely important for reasoning for us to follow what's happening in Latin America, and we can see, and perhaps take some lessons from that. So,
I continue from before. I mean, one of the things that didn't this summer didn't stop at the extensions, because some countries did go there, but many of them went there to criticize the United States, particularly the Argentina. But also beforehand, they didn't go, was Mexico. The Mexican president, I'm just trying to think of his name. Yes, Andres Obrador gave the United States a serve. But Argentina and other countries in Los Angeles told the United States, how dare you, in a grouping that's supposed to be of American nations who are supposed to be equal and talk on an equal level, how dare you decide on your own who attends, who doesn't attend? And the second one is, how dare you impose policy? This is supposed to be collectively determined, not just by the United States. As a result, it walked out with nothing. And I just want to mention the theme of the summit: building a sustainable, resilient, and equitable future. There was nothing about building sustainability that came out of there, or economic resilience, and there certainly wasn't about equality. It was a non-event, a complete failure for the United States. Now, while that was going on, there was another summit going on in the same city, and that was the People's Summit, that involved 225 unions, alliances, and movements from many countries. And they had discussions on a range of topics. And I'll include some of them. The question of democracy loomed large. What is it, and for who? What sort of democracy do we need? Building unity, international cooperation, healthcare as a human right, the liberation of women, and the prevention of war. Now, these are all worthy themes. Why didn't the other summit talk about any of these? The reality is the United States finds itself more isolated than it has been for much of its history at the moment. Yes, it is managing to milk a bit of capital out of the conflict in the Ukraine, to an extent, but I think this is hollow. I don't think this will last. But we're really faced with two choices, aren't we? Which direction do we all in this world want to move in?
And I think that's the key question: is what is the direction? When we ask ourselves the questions about not so much about what we want or what we need, but what direction are we going and how are we going to get there? How do we get these things that we need? And I think it's becoming painfully clear that the United States and that the world economic system that we live in is possibly not going to be able to deliver. In fact, it's looking like we're on the brink of major recessions so around the world, and so now we really have to look at, well, we need these things. We need, and we have a right to healthcare, and we have a right to schools, and we have a right to universities, and the highest level of housing, and so on. But how are we going to get there? Because, as I said, certainly the economic system we're living in is not going to allow us to achieve those things. So I think when you were saying that the United States is becoming isolated, I think that's true for a lot of the Western democracies as well, because once again it brings into question the whole the whole idea that, well, we're not going to be able to deliver on our economic system, and our democratic system is not going to be able to deliver on things that we actually need in a time of recession. So how is that all going to affect the balance of global forces? How do we see things panning out in the future? It's looking more and more like there's going to be new economic systems developing between global powers around the world, such as the Russia and China, Brazil, India. They're all forming an alliance, a monetary alliance, an economic alliance, so that the United States and Wall Street doesn't have the power to control the entire world economically. And so how do we see that maybe affecting places like Australia and Venezuela and these countries that are vying for independence? How do we see that new economic development giving them more hope?
Yeah, well, I'd suppose I want to pose it in answering the question, what does the future look like? And there are a number, I think, key elements to that. I think we're seeing, as far as the United States is concerned, we've seen a certain shift towards isolation where, the United States had a lot more popularity not so long ago. So that's coming out of its own, out of the history as it's unfolding. One of the curious things at the moment, if we go just briefly again to Ukraine, is that the imposition of sanctions and the commitment of military hardware and the other stuff going along with it, the removal of Russia from the into the global financial system is having repercussions at home. So it is one, it's not the only one, but it's one of the factors that's causing declines in economies, rise of inflation. It's causing shortages of certain things and important things. And it's having a negative economic impact on the United States and other countries that are following along, particularly Europe, and it's having a bad economic impact to some extent on Australia as well. So that's one thing, and I think there's been a tendency that there's an emergent tendency. The more this happens, the more moves they take, the more they hurt their so-called friends and themselves. And I think that's a reality. United States now has been pushed in a situation of calling on Venezuela for oil. Last week, a number of European countries started doing the same thing. So they're knocking on Venezuela's door, please, can we have some oil? Now, these are countries that agreed and participated on a ban on the export of Venezuelan oil or anything else from Venezuela or import anything to there. So when their needs come, the solidarity starts to come apart. We've had the case where in other parts of the world where, and I want to bring the question of China up, not going into detail, because right at the moment, as the G7 That is the few sort of select countries coming together for a meeting. The preamble's already been that this is mainly directed at China, not Russia, at China. Now, Australia's been recruited into that, slanging off at China every now and then, and when it's there is uh, an export from Australia stopped at every turn. The United States has knocked on the Chinese door and said, "Oh, we'll fill in the void. We'll take the contract." So Australia's been used like a dummy to do the PR, the negative PR for the United States. And the United States doesn't even honour Australia by staying out of it. Right? Right
Yeah.
across the board. Wheat, beef, everything, wine, everything. They've tried to fill in the hole.
Yeah.
So that's one scenario. One of the tendencies that's coming, they are hurting themselves and isolating themselves more. But there's also, as you mentioned, Alan, a shifting in the balance of forces globally. The United States is no longer the unquestioned dominant power. It is not so much the emergence of two blocks. At the moment, it kind of looks that way, but it is more the emergence of what some are calling a multipolar world. In other words, a global order that's not dominated by any particular power. And that's a good thing because it releases, it allows more freedom, more movement, more freedom in terms of trade, economic freedom, but also politically. It allows nations more space to determine their future. So that is becoming so, and it's unstoppable at this point.
Yeah. For
Well, it's
sure.
not going to turn around. And I think the third factor, and Venezuela also comes into it, is a growing commitment of peoples to assert their authority. And this is happening. We've gone through a period of relative pessimism where it seemed the power against you was too big. But now there's a growth of optimism beginning where in nations, various nations, people are regaining hope and feeling that they can make a difference. So if we put these 3 points together, that the future does look positive. But there's also a negative side to it because it involves political polarization across nations. We're having that in the United States at the moment with the abortion issue. It's primarily, I don't think about abortion. I mean, that is important, but it's a shift in the balance of political forces. There's a shift by the Supreme Court and those who, particularly the judges appointed by Trump, to uh, to impose more Big Brother, to pull away rights that were won through history, and so that's one side. We've also got the rise of ultra right and fascist movements in many countries, including the United States. That is a challenge that needs to be faced because these do not stand for the same values or the values of the origins of the American Revolution. We have a drive, and I think this is a real risk that of the United States as its diplomatic clout weakens, it resorts increasingly to use of military force and the threats of war. And the danger is that there will be more war if we're not careful. That and the biggest danger, and a lot of people have been saying it, the biggest risk is another world war. I'm not saying it will happen. I think we all need to be careful to make sure that doesn't happen. And it is important for there to be a peace movement. But a peace movement also needs to have, as part of its package, an insistence on the respect of other nations, the respect of peoples in other nations, non-interference in the internal affairs of other nations. You know, to behave as equals in international affairs rather than I say what goes and you obey. So we need to have a peace movement that fights to enforce these values as well in order to prevent war. And I think if we can prevent war and people keep on gaining the confidence, I think we're in for a much better world.
Well, and I think on that note, Joe, I think that's a great place to finish this conversation. And I look forward to joining you for another conversation about Venezuela. So without anything further, at some for people that listen to our show, please feel free to email the Venezuela Solidarity Campaign. Please feel free to get in touch with us, make comment on our video, make suggestions how we can improve it. And if you'd like to get involved, please message us, and we're more than happy for people to get involved in finding out about what's happening in Venezuela, finding out about what's happening in Latin America, and just generally getting involved and seeing how the future is going to unveil itself, and getting involved in that process as well. So without anything further, I'll see you, Joe, at the next meeting.
See you then.